let's talk a little bit about pommels and balance without ending someone rightly. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So pommels, what do they do? Well, we've spoken a lot about pommels in the past. Solid pommels, hollow pommels, globular pommels, wheel pommels, fishtail pommels, scent stopper pommels. I'll probably do a video just on pommels one day, maybe. Maybe that'd be too boring, I don't know. And we've even talked about taking pommels off and throwing them at people. But actually the point I want to make about in this video is not so much about pommels as about balance. Now, there are several ways of achieving a point of balance where you want it on a sword. If you have a one-handed sword like this and you want to adjust the point of balance, you either have to take away weight from one end or from the other end. You could take away weight from the middle, but taking weight away from the middle isn't going to make a huge difference. So for example, if I sawed off the blade up here and made it shorter, very clearly the point of balance would move closer to the hand. That's a no-brainer. I'm removing mass from the tip. But assuming I don't want to give up reach, if I wanted to, for example, make this sword chop better or hit with more power, one way I could do it is put a lighter pommel on it. And that's when it comes around to my point. I was thinking about reenactment swords, and I was thinking about the swords that we like in HEMA, the swords that people like in reenactment, or indeed even LARP simulated swords, or perhaps Battle of the Nations type, full contact armoured combat swords. Armoured combat as in hitting each other's armour rather than historical armoured combat, which was about thrusting into gaps, so a different thing. And basically what people want is partly individual, that's the first thing to say, but generally if you take a demographic from any of those one groups, what they want is also dictated by what the demands of their particular hobby are. So, for example, if we take reenactment, in reenactment they are hitting each other most of the time. They don't generally thrust. Most groups in Western Europe don't thrust, or I think in America and Australia don't thrust. And most groups are pulling their blows, so when they hit, they're not aiming to bam, power through something, they're hitting and stopping. Okay, so what they need fundamentally is a sword that they can use for a prolonged period of time, because you might be doing a reenactment fight for far longer than you would actually do a real fight. You want a sword that you can use for a protracted amount of time, but it also can't be very light because you need to have thick edges to be durable, because reenactment combat is famously brutal on swords because the swords are used a bit to clang, 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 clang against the other swords. Which obviously in real combat you're not focusing on going clang, clang, clang on real swords, you're focusing on just hitting someone. Now if a sword is predominantly hitting bodies, it doesn't, clearly it needs to be sharp, but it doesn't need to necessarily be as overbuilt and kind of tank-like as a reenactment sword is. Now I know it varies by which reenactment scene you're talking about. Some scenes within reenactment in the world use lighter, quicker swords and fight in more of a HEMA way. I know that there are some groups doing Viking era combat, you know, like Roland Vorcheka, the kind of reenactment groups that he mixes with, I think they tend to fight in more of a HEMA way. So they're probably fighting for, if they're not wearing protection, fairly light contact, or even non-contact some of the time, but quite quickly and stuff. So they may use swords more similar to what we use in HEMA. But you know, HEMA swords, it's not to say that HEMA swords are necessarily always more like real swords either. The swords that we use, for example, have to be flexible, more flexible than the real swords are. If I take one of my Victorian antiques, or indeed if I take a sharp replica, they'll be stiffer than most HEMA swords are. Most HEMA swords are on the floppy side because we need them to be for safer thrusting. But coming back to balance, therefore this affects what kind of balance we want. And one thing that I noted so I dabbled in reenactment when I was younger, when HEMA didn't really exist when I was a teenager. So I did a bit of sport fencing, a bit of kendo, quite a bit of kung fu, and a bit of reenactment. And so I was kind of trying to triangulate on something that ended up being HEMA, and when HEMA existed I basically stopped most of the things. I just carried on doing sport fencing a bit, but and just focused on HEMA. But before HEMA existed, I did do a bit of reenactment, and one of the things that frustrated me, because I was already collecting antique swords by that point, so I knew what a real sword was like. One of the things that frustrated me about reenactment swords is, number one, they, at that point in Britain, they were pretty much all overweight. They were over heavy. And the reason for that was because they were given big, fat blades and edges. They had to have a rounded tip, they had to have thick edges, and therefore the blades tended to be somewhat spoon-like, is what I normally refer to them as. But additionally, to balance out the kind of chunky blade, they got chunky hilts as well, and the guards tended to be thicker made than most actual antique sword guards are, and the pommels are generally big and heavy and solid. As I've mentioned in previous videos, many original medieval pommels are actually hollow or partially hollow, so they're not as heavy as they necessarily look. But most reenactment swords are completely solid lumps of metal on the end of the pommel because they're having to balance out a relatively heavy blade. But in addition to that, there is, at least in Britain when I was a teenager and sort of about 20 years old, there was a tendency for reenactment swords in Britain to be very back-weighted. And so this relates to Pirates of the Caribbean, amazingly. Who would have expected that? But in Pirates of the Caribbean, there's a reference to a sword balancing like basically at the crossguard. Now, for a sword that you're going to cut with, generally speaking, a sword that balances at the crossguard is bollocks. It's really bad, because you've got no authority in the blade. You can't even really feel the blade. In the bind, well, it's okay in the bind, I suppose, if you bind near the base of the blade. But there are swords historically that do balance very close to the guard. There are some examples, but even most rapiers, most historical rapiers, which are, you know, point-centric swords that are not supposed to be giving great big cuts, even most historical rapiers don't balance right at the guard. Most of them balance a few inches, in fact, not that different to an infantry officer's sabre, so usually a few inches from the crossguard. So by sticking a massive heavy pommel, yes, you could end them more rightly. No, you couldn't, because most pommels don't unscrew. But by putting a massive heavy pommel on the end of a sword and back weighting it, you make it diabolical at cutting. Now, ironically, in something like Battle of the Nations, and this is to use a different example, they strongly now favour falchions with very beefy ends of the blade and a lot of mass at the tip of the weapon and relatively light hilts. Because of course you think about what they're doing in Battle of the Nations and HMB and all that kind of stuff, IMCF and all of the other acronyms they like, they are walloping each other's armour. Now, if you're going to wallop someone's armour, what's the best weapon to use? A mace. So if you kind of want the properties of a mace in the shape of a sword, what do? I know, we'll make a really heavy weapon that's the shape of a falchion with a big end and a light handle that will handle like a mace. So what they've done is they've reinvented the sword, and it's not really a sword. They've reinvented it. It's a mace. It's a mace in sheep's clothing. It's a mace in sword clothing. So it has the properties of a mace and is really unlike historical. Really, I have to reiterate this. Really unlike historical falchions. As I've shown with my Conyers-ish falchion that I've got, the blades are light. It's a massive, great broad blade, and they rarely weigh more than 2.5 to 3 pounds. So they're the same weight as a medieval arming sword. It's just that the weight is distributed in different places. But falchions are thin, fine, cutting blades like a big machete. They are not big blunt maces. Right, so I've spoken about falchions in the past. I'm sure I'll talk about them again, but that's not what this video is about. This video is about point of balance and pommel. So there is another way that you can make a weapon apart from shortening a blade or lightening a blade or adding a bigger pommel, and that is to lengthen the grip. Now, it's just simple mechanics here, okay? Very clearly, if I've got a given weight acting on this lever, if I make that lever longer, that weight would now do that, okay? So it would now, you would need, if you want the balance point to stay the same, if I lengthen the grip, I have to make the pommel lighter. So for that reason, you will sometimes find that if you've got a long sword and an arming sword, that is a two-handed sword and a one-handed sword, that have the same total weight, and yes, two-handed swords tend to be slightly heavier than one-handed swords, but let's assume you've got, and this is within plausible historical weight limits, a one-handed sword which weighs 3 pounds and a long sword which weighs 3 pounds. If you want them to have the same point of balance, the long sword will have a smaller or lighter or hollow pommel. Okay, so it will have to be lighter if you want the point of balance to be the same. Now, in terms of point of balance, just to sum up and conclude, without going on for too long, the point of balance, why would you want it in different places? Well, very simply speaking, in recreational swordplay that we do in the modern world, it's usually to do with safety or control or stamina, or in the unusual case of Battle of the Nations, hitting harder. So if you want to hit harder, you move the point of balance up the blade, which very often means making the pommel lighter, or even the grip shorter can help. If you want to bring the point of balance back down here, clearly you have to make the end of the blade lighter or make the hilt or pommel heavier. And in most cases, in HEMA for example, we tend to have relatively light blades, similar to historical, well in fact basically the same as historical weights, and so we don't have to worry about it too much. For the most part, HEMA swords are about the same weight as a real sword. So we tend to have realistic weight hilts and pommels, and then a realistic weight blade that's just made more flexible than a real sharp blade. And of course it's blunt. Reenactment swords tend to be a bit overweight for durability and tend to have overweight pommels to bring the point of balance closer back to the hand and make them better for control, and so you're not going to break your friend's arm when you hit them. With real swords, why would you want it different? Well, it's the same thing. If you want a sword that's going to be quicker and more nimble, then bringing the point of balance back is a good thing. And for that reason, things like rapiers and small swords and thrust-centric swords tend to, they don't always, but they tend to have points of balance closer to the hand, so that you can move the point around more nimbly, and when you defend, you can still defend with authority, because you've still got that mass down at the hilt end of the weapon. Swords that you want to be effective cutters, if you look at the most effective cutters out there, things like katanas, tulwars, kilich, falchions, these type of weapons that are very clearly specialised towards cutting, the point of balance will usually tend to be further up the blade, which of course affects the weight of the mass of the hilt and the design of the hilt. Things like arming swords and military sabres and back swords and Highland broadswords and things like this tend to sit somewhere in the middle. They tend to not have a balance point that's right next to the hand and not have a balance point that's sort of 10 inches up the blade. And that is generally speaking the range that we're talking about. Historical swords tend to range, their point of balance tends to range from the hilt out to about 12 inches, you're going to laugh at what I think is 12 inches now, but about 12 inches, and that's about the extreme. If we look at something like a 1796 light cavalry sabre or a kilich or some tulwars, then very often the point of balance is about 6 to 8 inches away from the hilt. 12 inches away from the hilt would be very, very extreme. Okay, arming swords, military sabres tend to be about 3 or 4 inches from the hilt. So that's the type of range we're talking about. You can convert these to centimetres, but we're essentially talking about most swords balance about that far from the guard. Some swords balance closer if they're specialised for certain purposes, and really dedicated chopping swords sometimes balance about a hand's span away from the hilt. I hope that's somewhat interesting and gives you some things to think about. Yeah, pommel size is inextricably related to grip length and what you want the sword to do. Cheers folks.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.